Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Elizabeth and I today are going to be taking a look at fertilizer decisions. We know a lot of you are looking at commodity prices and inputs and wondering where you can save money. And soil fertility may be one of those areas of consideration, but we want you to do it strategically, and we have some tips for you to do that.
Yeah, fertilizer costs have been coming down slowly over the past few years, but they are still going to be one of the most costly inputs for you this coming season. So we think by carefully assessing the efficiency of your fertilizer usage, it might be possible to cut that bill without costing you yield.
Yeah, so of course the biggest concern with reducing fertilizer is of course yield loss, and that really leads us to soil sampling. So you don't know what you don't know. When I'm teaching my master gardeners, I like to say don't guess, soil test. So it's impossible to know the ability of that soil to supply nutrients to your crop without soil testing. Okay, no one can guess. We have to actually do that test, especially when it comes to phosphorus and potassium.
So let's do a quick review of soil sampling. This is one of my favorite topics. First, you're going to want to decide what area you want your sample to cover. A furrow slice is typically 6.7 inches deep across an acre, and that is equal to 2 million pounds of soil. So when we're pulling those soil samples, one of the things to keep in mind is you're using a very small amount of soil to make a very important decision about a lot of soil and field area. So the university recommends that you keep those samples to 25 acres or less per sample. Smaller is going to give you more ability to identify variability that exists potentially, because again, as you can imagine, 1 pint of soil that you're sending in representing 50 million pounds of soil can leave a lot of that variability uncovered. What you're able to sample and how small of a grid is going to depend on your budget and field history. But if you're just starting out, 25 acres may be a good place to start. And it's better than nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So you can break those samples down, based on soil type, grid. There's 2.5 acre grids, 1 acre, half acre, again, depending on your budget and how much detail you want. And zone is something that's become popular in recent years with precision technology.
Yeah. My personal recommendation is if you're really starting to first understand that variability in your field, grid sampling is a great place to start. It is going to be more costly as a trade-off, but it gives you a systematic way to see how that soil changes in terms of soil fertility across the field. If you're going to sample by zone, make sure you're using data layers that are going to help. Yield is a really popular one, but do keep in mind that soil fertility is only part of the story when you're looking at a yield map.
Yeah, that's some good advice. So tri-state recommendations are based on an 8-inch sample. So we typically recommend sampling to that depth. We can get into that variation a little bit, but we're keeping it simple right now, just giving an overview. So again, tri-state recommendations are based on that 8-inch sample. If you have a soil probe, try to get consistent depth and down to that 8-inch mark.
Again, we're trying to do an estimate of the fertility in a very large area with a small amount of soil. So you want to make sure you get a good aggregate sample. The recommendation is to pull 15 to 25 cores, mix them together, and then pull your cup or pint for the soil bag from that mixed soil. How you pull those samples is going to depend on whether you're doing grid or zone. If you're doing grid sampling, you want to pull them near to the center point. If you're doing zone sampling, you want to spread those cores out from across your zone.
That's a quick overview. If you've never sampled before, then reach out to your extension rep, or I'll put some links in the show notes with more details. There is some other things that you should keep in mind, but we just wanted to give a quick overview if there are folks listening who've never sampled before.
Yeah, and getting a high quality sample is really the most important first step. Once you get those results back, you're going to have an idea of what the fertility supply in the soil is, and then the tri-state fertility recommendations are going to help you take it from there. You can use those recommendations to determine if your fertility is low, and if it is, to what degree, and then use that to determine what rates would be appropriate for application.
Just a note on the drought conditions for 2024, we may have seen reduced yield in some areas that likely lowered the amount of fertilizer or fertility that was removed from the soil. So lower yields remove less P and K. Also, very dry soils can affect those soil test results, especially when we look at potassium and pH values. So if you've sampled in the past, you sampled this year, and you saw way different values, it may have been a result of those drought conditions. We typically don't see huge swings in that 3 to 4 year time if you sampled the same time of year and the same method. But we went into depth on this in episode 109, back when we had another dry fall. So you can listen in. Greg Labarge shares with us some tips about soil sampling in dry conditions.
Yeah, generally speaking, those values are probably going to be a little lower than normal if we don't get some rain to catch up our soil moisture. So if you have a field that's normally in range and it's a little low this year, I wouldn't panic. It may be environmental and not actually your fertility. Amanda mentioned soil pH, and I know her and I were out on the circuit last winter talking about soil pH, because when we talk about fertility, that really can be one of the most critical pieces for making sure that you have the nutrients available that your crop needs. We know that when soil pH drops below 6.5, phosphorus availability is going to rapidly decrease, and below 6, the plant availability of many other nutrients such as potassium, sulfur, and magnesium can also decrease. So knowing that that can impact it so much, paying attention to your soil pH and liming when it's appropriate can really help with your soil fertility, and maybe a more cost-effective way to make nutrients available as opposed to making a full nutrient application.
So just a few reminders then about that lime application. So base it on your buffer pH. So when you are getting your soil tested, make sure that that test includes a buffer pH and just not your pH. Okay, buffer pH is important, and that's what you need to base your rate on. We do have table in the Ohio Agronomy Guide to help you determine what those application rates are. You also need to know the effective neutralizing power of your lime source, and they have to provide that to you. So make sure you get that wherever or whatever lime source you're using, get that E&P number, and then there's a factor to adjust for tillage depth as well. So in the agronomy guide, there's also a multiplication rate. So if you're no-till, or if you do deep tillage, it's going to take a different amount of lime, because lime, if it's lying on the surface, it's only going to neutralize the top couple inches, for example.
Yeah, Amanda, you mentioned that effective neutralizing power. One of the things that I've heard a lot about this fall are alternative liming products. And yeah, that's something to keep an eye on. A lot of, maybe not a lot, but I have heard of some products that are available to farmers, being sold to farmers as a liming agent. Make sure you're asking the right questions and understanding how these products work, and specifically ask about that effective neutralizing power, not just because you need it for the calculation, but because it will help you do the economic analysis as to whether this product that is potentially cheaper is actually a cost-effective option and not just a less effective option.
Right. If it has a lower E&P, it should be less expensive, but does that make up for how much extra you'll have to apply? So once you get your soil pH in line, then you can look at those P and K values again and see where you're at and what the probability of seeing a yield reduction might be if you decide not to apply fertilizer.
So each crop has a critical soil test level where below that level, the odds of seeing a yield loss is going to increase if you don't get that fertilizer applied. A lot of our soils in Ohio actually are above or are in what we call the maintenance range, which would provide you an opportunity to cut back on rates potentially without the risk of yield, or with a much lower risk of yield loss.
Those maintenance ranges, again, are available in the tri-state. Corn and soybeans, phosphorus is 20 to 40 parts per million. Again, we switched to using Malic 3 as opposed to Bray P1 if you have one of the old tri-states. So another key point in interpreting your soil test results is make sure you look at whether it's in ppm or pounds per acre, what the extractant used was, And then does that match the tri-state tables? Because that can throw off your recommendation. If you're growing wheat and alfalfa, bump that up. Keep it up more around 30 to 50 parts per million. So potassium will vary a little bit. If you're in a loam or clay soil, that's 120 to 170 parts per million. With sandier soils, you can drop that down to 100 to 130 parts per million.
Some other things to consider maybe, are you gaining an efficiency in your fertilizer by the way you're applying it? So if you're applying subsurface or you're applying closer to in season when the crop needs it, you may be able to shave a little bit off of your rates without yield loss because you're not worried about loss over the fall or in season, and a higher percentage of that fertilizer you're applying is going to be available to the crop. So just another opportunity there to consider. When margins are tight, finding little bits to shave off can make a big difference.
Yep, and this tri-state data is backed up by extensive research. Over 400 fields for our phosphorus trials went in, and there is clear evidence that when you're in that maintenance range, it's very unlikely that you will see a yield bump from additional fertilizer. So manure is a great source of nutrients, and a lot of people have come to realize that. I personally have always been a big fan of manure. It really comes down to, can you actually get a hold of it, because it is a popular product now, and how expensive is it to move? So of course, liquid manure can be really expensive to move, more than half a mile to a mile. But it might be worth asking a neighbor if they have any to go. And of course, poultry litter, if you can get a hold of that, is easier and more affordable, and also is a really good source, a well-rounded source of nutrients compared to sometimes some other nutrient sources.
Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity there if you have manure in your system to give yourself credit and maybe pull back on that commercial fertilizer this year. And
oh, yeah, for sure.
Give yourself credit for the nutrients that are in that manure that you're applying.
Yeah, and if you can adjust your application timing, if you do have manure, to apply that in the spring and utilize that nitrogen more efficiently, then you can really start to save. And of course, we have a lot of research Glenn Arnold has done showing yield differences between even surface application versus injection at the same time. Getting it underneath the soil really protects that nitrogen in the spring so the crop can utilize it.
Yeah, we've done a lot of on-farm research over the years, and a lot of times we're telling you guys that, there's no yield difference. Glenn's story has always been different. That manure in season, I don't think it's ever been a loser.
No, I don't think so.
The other consideration is going to be nitrogen. I know a lot of you guys are going to hold off till spring, and that's probably one of the first things we would recommend is, the efficiency of spring applied or in-season applied nitrogen compared to fall applied is definitely a winner as well.
Yes, please don't apply fall nitrogen, commercial fall nitrogen.
It can be tempting if the prices are good. But generally, we've seen nitrogen sources coming down from what we had a peak, 2020, 2021, and those prices have come down. Nitrogen more so than the other fertilizers. So take advantage of that as well.
You mentioned all the anhydrous ammonia TikToks going on out west. So if you have that in your feed, it doesn't work as well in Ohio.
Yeah. Well, we know that soil holds onto that nitrogen better when it stays cold. And I don't remember the last time we've had a winter where our soils have stayed cold. So I think the risk of making those fall applications and losing it over the course of the winter is higher than it used to be. I do an unofficial poll at my fertilizer meetings every fall. And I think probably 95% of the farmers that I see at those meetings are doing either spring or in-season applied nitrogen. Side dress is our most popular timing here in Ohio. So you guys are doing great.
Yeah. I don't think it's a widespread thing, but just in case you're getting any ideas about it. So I did run the MRTN calculator here with current corn and nitrogen prices, and the profitable nitrogen range is 152 to 180 pounds per acre. So I'm sure 152 might make some of you a little nervous. 180 might be closer to where you're at. But again, if you're looking at profitability rather than just maximizing yield, maybe sacrificing profitability, then check out the MRTN tool and see if it's something you might want to use to save some money this next year.
Yeah, so that is an economic tool. And so that lower recommended rate is reflected because of that corn price that we're seeing right now, and that fertilizer prices haven't really come down at the same pace that our commodity prices have come down. This year, hopefully, is a lesson. We talked about pushing that application into the season if you can. I think a lot of us left nitrogen on the table with our crop yields this year. And so giving yourself that opportunity to see how weather is playing out can buy you some time and hopefully make a more efficient decision with your nitrogen. We hate to apply it and then see it sitting in the fields going into fall and winter and then not being able to benefit our crops the next summer.
Or going out through the tile because it rained a bunch too.
And nobody wants to have to mow the ditches extra because the grass is growing so well.
Okay, so this was a lot of information. We threw some numbers at you. There's a lot more information out there as far as the research goes. So if you want to dive into that more, we did have a corn article on this a few weeks ago. So I'll link that up and you can look at the data behind the tri-state, and we'll link up the tri-state too. So if you don't have that yet, you can get easy access to it. So with that, we wish you the best of luck this fall as you wrap things up. And hopefully this helps you make some smart decisions, can help that bottom line a little bit more, and we'll see how things turn out next year.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.
Hey podcast listeners, just a reminder to give us a like or subscribe so you know when we release new episodes. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to leave us a review also. We appreciate the comments.